Good afternoon and welcome to today's program titled Telecommunications Act Rewrite, the Need for Engagement. My name is Randy Evans. I'm an attorney in private practice, and I also serve as the chair of the Tribal Telecom Conference Advisory Council. I'll be your host for today's program. Our speaker today is Greg Geis. I'll introduce Greg in just a minute. As a matter of personal introduction, I was raised in northwestern New Mexico on and near the Navajo Reservation. My wife Sharon and our 3 children are enrolled members of the Navajo Nation. Before I formally introduce Greg and before he begins today's program, I'd like to take just a couple minutes to talk about the Tribal Telecom Conference and this webinar series. The annual Tribal Telecom and Technology Conference serves as a gathering place to share information, explore solutions, and to create new possibilities for pathways across the digital divide in Indian country, and to make information and communications technologies accessible to American Indian and Alaskan Native communities. Key focus areas at the conference include infrastructure, community and economic development, culture, education, and government, and public safety, emergency management, and health. Our 4th annual Tribal Telecom Conference will be held in Albuquerque, New Mexico on May 4 through 7 of 2015. Be sure to mark your calendars for those dates and also visit the conference website to register and to learn about sponsorship opportunities. The website for the conference is tribaltelecomconference.com. As background about this webinar series, following this year's 2014 conference in February, we received a number of requests for year-round educational opportunities that expand on and supplement the topics addressed at the annual conference. The Tribal Telecom webinar series marks the beginning of our efforts to respond to these requests. As for today's agenda, Greg will be speaking for about 40 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions after his formal presentation. If you do have questions, please use the question box on the webinar toolbar. You can type in your questions during the program or after Greg's presentation. And if your question relates specifically to something that Greg is addressing, I will jump in and present that question for Greg. If it's a more general question, then we'll save those for the end of the program. And now to introduce today's speaker. We're very fortunate to have Greg Geis as our presenter today. Greg is an attorney with the law firm of Akin Gump in Washington, D.C. Before joining Akin Gump, Greg served as the Director of Legislative Affairs at the FCC, and he has also worked on Capitol Hill. You can find out more information about Greg on Akin Gump's website, which is akingump.com, AKINGUMP.com. And his contact information is also available at the end of this presentation. And with that introduction, I will now turn the program over to Greg.
All right. Hello, everyone. Let me not jump the gun here and get us where we need to be. There we go. So thanks again, everybody, for dialing in today. Just wanted to spend some time. Hopefully, it'll be a little shy of 40 minutes, but not much, to discuss the Communications Act rewrite effort that is underway in the House of Representatives for this Congress, but certain to be a topic in both chambers when the new Congress comes in January of next year. So I wanted to start, I thought, with why is this important to this audience? And I think it's worth remembering or telling folks that back in the '96 Act, there was actually an effort underway to have better recognition of tribal interests codified in the Communications Act. Because those efforts came along fairly late in the process, they didn't occur. And so given the importance of broadband and access to it, it seemed that if Congress is going to rewrite this act, at this time we need to make certain that tribal areas and the telcos that represent them have an opportunity to make certain their voices heard and their needs are addressed through the Act. So, and I would add that comprehensive rewrite opportunities don't come along often. I think there was the 1934 Act, the 1996 Act. There are a couple of other acts that have occurred, sort of more tweaks in some ways than fundamental changes. So with that, what I wanted to do today is just kind of give you guys a roadmap of what we're going to do. We're going to look at the current structure and the key provisions of the Communications Act as they stand today. And we'll go through a little bit about the white paper series. I've listed them here so you guys have an easy place to refer back to. Then we'll talk about sort of the fundamentals of the effort. What does the process look like? What are the issues that are being teed up? And what might be some key areas to consider for engagement in that process. So with that, let's move over to the current framework of the Communications Act. You guys are probably most familiar with Title II, which is the Common Carrier Provision, which talks about equitable, non-discriminatory access to telecommunications services. Title I, which is often an area where the Commission finds jurisdiction in this day and age, did it with cable, has done it in some regards with broadband internet access service, not broadband, confers jurisdiction to the Commission over all wire and radio communications. So sort of its broadest grant of authority, but in some ways it's most difficult to navigate legally. Title III is radio. Radio includes wireless as well as television and radio as we think of them in our cars. Title IV is a procedural and administrative, so this is where some of the more, comply with the APA type of things are housed. Title V is penal provisions, that's if you get in trouble. Title VI is the cable services provision, and Title VII has some miscellaneous things. I believe Title VII might be where the National Telecommunications Information Administration's authority is housed. So as Congress embarked on this, one of the things that they, Chairman Walden and Chairman Upton indicated was that they felt like the 1930s provisions may need to be updated for the modern communications networks that we now operate. And so what they wanted to do is explore, which provisions of the Act are relevant, which need changing, which need modifying, and which need eliminating. And as part of that, they cite convergence and changes in technology as a basis for making certain provisions of the Act obsolete. One that has come up over the years with the FCC is whether or not broadband internet access service, this is abbreviated here, sorry, should be a covered service. And they also would like to look at what the role of the FCC should be going forward. In some ways, you guys are probably have heard of the debate that's gone on about whether or not the FCC is overreached in its authority. Sorry, let me just take a look at this and see if there we go. Whether the FCC has been overreaching in its authority or whether it's played an appropriate role. And so all of those are sort of the backdrop against what Congress is considering. This slide is really sort of a schoolhouse rock type slide, sort of how the process would work in terms of updating an act. So there's the committee hearings that will be, so the committee will draft legislation. They'll have a series of hearings around issues in that legislation to help inform the language. Step 2, the committee would basically vote. This is very streamlined, by the way. Step 3, you have a full House and Senate vote. Step 4, if the legislation between the chambers is different, you go to what's called conference, and you work out those differences. Step 5, you go back out. You get your full votes from both chambers again for the harmonized legislation, and the president either signs or vetoes it. The really important thing to remember here is that before Step 1 starts, there are already steps underway, and that's what the committee has been working on with these white papers. So it's sort of helping to build a record so that they can draft legislation that understands and is aware of some of the issues that people have raised through these white papers. So one of the main questions the committee has asked is what principles under the current law should remain in a reformed act. So things like universal access, universal service, consumer protection, promoting competition, ensuring public safety and reliability. So those are sort of bedrock principles that have in some ways been there since the 1934 Act. And so, one would ask whether or not those principles are still the relevant ones. And in fact, we'll see that's in fact one of the questions that they asked. So in making these changes, that's where Congress is focused. Here's again the list. We'll go straight into modernization principles. So as you can see, one of the first things that Congress asked us about was what are the principles that should guide their revision? Should changes in technology be a driving force? Should convergence in technology and consumer expectations be the driving force? And there, I think, it's interesting. Some commenters have indicated on the record that any reform should be technology agnostic, and that technology doesn't really determine sort of these fundamental principles that underlie what we do. Others have said that the technology has made a lot of the regulations irrelevant. And so that's sort of what Congress will be grappling with. So again, the goal, as they stated, is to have a flexible statute that's technology neutral in some ways, but recognizes that technology has gone through some fundamental changes. And then sort of, in some ways in the weeds, this distinction between telecom service and information service, does it remain relevant, or should the Act try to harmonize around that? In spectrum policy, some of the questions here less related to wireline businesses, but as all of you are looking at what your businesses do, it may be that spectrum starts to become an area where you increasingly look to focus. If that is the case, then some of the questions here could be of very particular interest to you. This first category is more about the spectrum policy that there's been a big debate over. So right now the FCC primarily licenses spectrum. There is some set aside for unlicensed use. Sharing is becoming more prevalent. In fact, in the Middle Class Tax Relief Act of 2012, Congress actually adopted provisions that told the FCC to look at sharing as opportunities, and specifically with federal users, some opportunities there. I would add, as part of that, federal buildings were asked to share their facilities and their spectrum, particularly around tribal lands, to try to expand access. And then the committee asked about spectrum licensing structure at the FCC just in general. And this has more to do with, should they allow flexible use of spectrum, or should they designate uses of spectrum? Auction revenues, obviously it's a part of the FCC's work around spectrum, but right now they actually make decisions based on a public interest finding. Revenues are not to be accounted for whatsoever in their decision making. The committee asked whether that's appropriate, given that the value of spectrum has been demonstrated to be significant, and there's some on the committee that believe the ability to return revenue to the Treasury should be the sole point of decision in that process. Others have fought for more public interest-based findings. Those include sort of minority access to spectrum, small business access to spectrum, tribal bidding credits, designating entities to encourage entry. And so those sorts of things are actually put into the mix when the FCC is crafting an auction today, and the committee would like to know if those things should remain relevant. And then the final one is the role that NTIA should play in all of this. It's a little outside the topic for today, I guess. In terms of competition, this white paper really focused on sort of what about the competition that has emerged in the communications space since the '96 Act should affect statutory change? In other words, can you start eliminating a substantial number of provisions from the statute given that competition can be found in the marketplace? Just a note on this, the committee does mention that competition isn't available everywhere, so there is recognition of that. But I think a lot of what the policy is looking at is eliminating rules, specifically under Title II, that are intended to ensure that competitors in a marketplace have access to facilities. Under Title III, trying to address access to spectrum in a competitive way, and then some other areas where they focused is whether the FCC should have authority over edge providers like the Googles and the Netflix and those folks. Generally, that is thought of as FTC's authority, but the committee, I think, asked this question given some of the interest in some of the larger players in wondering about harmonizing regulations between them and these emerging providers. And then they asked whether the act should require periodic reauthorization. If some of you follow Congress closely, this is the year that reauthorization of the Satellite Television Enhancement and Localism Act is up, which is basically the provisions that govern satellite television providers' ability to get access to broadcast material. That provision comes up for renewal every 5 years, and generally it goes down to the wire. So it has not been renewed yet, and in fact, as Congress was on their way out the door just last week, the Commerce Committee in the Senate had tried to hold a vote on it, but couldn't. And so one can question whether or not that's the sort of stability that folks in this sector would be looking for, but it is a question that the committee asked. And in terms of interconnection, as most of you know, interconnection plays a critical role in what you do in your networks. The committee's focus was more on what role the FCC should have in that process. So in other words, should it be left to independent negotiation, contract law sort of principle, or should the Act retain a role for the FCC to settle disputes when there were disputes regarding interconnection? They also asked what role intermodal, wireless versus wireline competition, how that should factor into interconnection mandates there. It's an eye towards, if there's intermodal competition, do parties actually have market power such that they could impose draconian requirements through interconnection on, say, a downstream competitor or a competitor or someone else in the market. Again, they asked whether IP interconnection, this one is of interest to you guys, IP interconnection, broadly they asked whether the FCC should have any role in interconnection that involves IP. But importantly for this audience, I think, they've asked whether IP interconnection has alleviated or exacerbated the problem with rural call completion. The FCC has taken a number of steps in that regard. I'll leave it to you guys to figure out how successful those steps have been. But here I think the committee is trying to recognize that maybe IP interconnection or IP has had a contributory effect on rural call completion, and they're wondering whether there's more that could be done there. Again, sort of this voluntary regime, they think of, mobile and the internet and whether those work. Some commenters pointed out that may not be exactly the right regime, and that those aren't exactly necessarily voluntary, but parties in the record have weighed in on both sides on that. Then the one that just got released concerns universal service. And here they asked whether Congress, sort of one of the key things that they asked is whether Congress should take a look at the principles that were codified in the '96 Act when they took universal service from an implicit program to an explicit program, whether those principles that were codified then should be the ones that remain, and whether the three that the FCC has adopted should be codified into the statute. So as many of you know, under the existing statute, there are these 6 principles, and there's a 7th principle that says the FCC can adopt other principles as it deems fit, necessary, whatever. And so, you know, I think the key here is the committee is asking, you know, sort of in recognition of this compact that's maybe, you know, sort of been there since 1934 when the FCC was stood up and Congress said make available to all people in this nation communication service. That's your goal. And then in '96 it was codified in 254. Here I think the committee's asking, you know, do these principles still ring necessary? And those principles include things like access to quality service at reasonable rates, regardless of where you live. Access to advanced communications and information services, regardless of where you live, and regardless of income level. Access to advanced services for the schools, libraries, and healthcare facilities that serve our communities and our children. And you know, and then recognizing that there are people that need to contribute into this, and they're going to be recipients of this program, whether or not the contribution language, which is basically all providers of telecommunications services, which can be somewhat limiting on the FCC's authority to broaden the base of contribution, whether that works, and this final principle of whether or not support to recipients should be specific, predictable, and sufficient to advance universal service, a principle I'm sure you're all very aware of. And then the FCC has adopted this competitive neutrality, direct funding for basically broadband, and the third one escapes me right now. But then the committee asked the question, given that there are these privately funded networks that operate in a lot of towns, whether that should have an effect on what the committee does regarding universal service. It also asks, what is the appropriate role of states and state commissions? Should the FCC have a more dominant role here, given that these networks have changed to mostly interstate networks? Also, what role should the Federal-State Joint Board play going forward? There, it's, you know, a question. The Federal-State Joint Board has said that the FCC has left it out of some fairly large decision-making where it could have maybe helped them in the context of high-cost reform. And I think that's the committee sort of recognizing that, you know, maybe that would have been a helpful process to go through. The committee also asked whether RUS and its grants and loans remains necessary, and other programs like that. And I think a number of commenters weighed in and sort of told their story about how RUS had helped them in their early days, and in many cases continues to be support that remains critical to ensuring that they can serve the communities that they've been designated to serve. Also, the committee asked about how do you ensure that support remains sufficient, but you keep a control on spending levels. And so I think that's revealing of the tension that exists in the debate that's going on, both at the FCC, but also on the Hill with a number of members of Congress, wondering, you know, whether or not support, given the caps that have been put in place and some of the changes, remains sufficient. And if not, how do we get it to be back to sufficient, and within that still control the spending? And then the committee asked the ultimate question in some regards, and that is whether these funding mechanisms are necessary at all. They ask about sort of eliminating some, not all, and you know, so I think it was an opportunity to give parties a chance to sort of defend if they take from a particular program why that remains relevant, if they think a particular program is no longer necessary, to explain why that would be the case. And then finally, the committee asked about whether or not there might be a more fundamental, say we keep the program, what are the fundamental ways that we could reform it? And maybe instead of having the FCC with these programs, maybe what you would do is block grant the money down to the states. Maybe you make it a consumer voucher. Maybe you do things like reverse auctions. Or if folks had other ideas, other means of distributing that. I know that these are ideas that have come up in other contexts, so the committee is aware that these are very sensitive issues, and I think in some ways gets that that there is great concern with moving to any of these, but they did feel the need to ask the question, and so important to weigh in there. So one of the things I wanted to sort of just think about, or get you guys maybe thinking about, is, so Congress has asked this series of questions. Have they asked the right series of questions? Next year is going to be a ramp-up year where they're going to try to come forward with legislation that, based on the information that they've gathered under these white papers, really starts to inform how they craft this legislation. And so what I was wondering is, these hard-to-serve areas, it seems to me in some ways, it was all within the universal service context that these issues came up, which may be sort of the primary area, but I think understanding a need to ensure that we continue to have a commitment to providing all consumers across this nation access to these services is critical. And, so sort of amplifying that going forward. Wondering whether the role of intermodal competition and what the committee says is a siloed statute where you treat, wireline different than cable, and cable different than wireless, and wireless different than, all, whether that remains relevant. I think in some ways, the service silos have produced a recognition that each of these services is in some ways distinct, and so I think it's an interesting area for the committee to explore, but there are different reasons that you may have different approaches for different technologies. And then finally, around these core principles, I think it's it's interesting that in the Universal Service White Paper, the committee really went sort of, in some ways, needing to build a fulsome record is important, but to go straight at some of the tough questions, it's good to ask the questions and have us reaffirm why it is that we believe these core principles of access for all at reasonable rates is a shared goal for the country and not a specific one that should try to be tackled by individual entities. So finally, I think, or not finally, but yeah, finally, moving forward, again, 2015 is going to be a very active year on the Hill in looking at this rewrite. And there's some key areas where I think engagement may be worth exploring in your communities as you talk to folks back home and your consumers and the people that you're serving. And so first and foremost, as I mentioned at the beginning, in the 96 Act, there was some late effort to try to get more recognition for tribal lands, tribal entities, and tribal governments. In the interest of full disclosure, I do some work with Gila River Telecom, and in the very first white paper, we had raised this issue around the need to codify tribal sovereignty so that the FCC knows that there is is kept to its recent, sort of, the FCC's done a good job of late working with tribal governments, but to ensure that that goes through administrations, we think it's worth codification of tribal sovereignty. Consultation, the importance of doing that to these communities to ensure that people understand what is expected and what's needed, more importantly, and how they can work together to achieve those goals. Universal connectivity, universal service, obviously a critical component not only of your businesses, but to ensure that there is somebody that is there to serve the people that live in these areas. So engagement on that point can't be understated. And then the opportunities that local providers have to serve their local communities and preservation of those opportunities. There, I think, identifying the key areas of the statute that are meaningful to your business, that's where that role comes in. And thinking more than just what you do today, but maybe what you might want to do in the future. So again, around spectrum, realizing that there is a provision in the statute today that says as part of an auction, the FCC must consider the role of small businesses, minorities, in crafting its rules. If those things are critical to you, then it may be worth looking at that as an opportunity to weigh in with the committee. And then just finally, around spectrum more generally, does it present an opportunity to change your business? And if so, does auction structure need to be, focused solely on revenue, or should we think more in terms of public interest? And so, with that, Randy, if we have questions, I'm happy to take them.
Thanks, Greg. And for the attendees, if you have questions, remember just type those in on the question box on the webinar toolbar there, and we'll address those as they come in. Greg, I've got a few follow-up questions. And the first one, in the area of telecom infrastructure deployment and service delivery in Indian country, we often hear the phrase that one size fits none, referring to the broad spectrum of needs and challenges and opportunities facing American Indian and Alaska Native communities, and also in recognition of each tribe's sovereignty and the federal policy of tribal self-determination. So how does this broad diversity among the various tribes and their needs and challenges impact or play out with regard to the efforts of Indian country to engage with Communication Act rewrite efforts? I guess put another way, should tribal communities be trying to coordinate efforts and speak with one voice, or should each community be advancing proposals that address its particular needs? Do you have any general thoughts on that?
Yeah, good question, Randy. It seems to me that a coordinated effort, given that this is likely to end up in some ways being, the goal might be to sort of have principles in place, although I should say that there's been a push of late to be a little bit more prescriptive in legislation. I think there are some general principles and general needs that if the community can come together, if these communities can come together and put together a list, I think it would certainly be more effective to have somebody, speaking for a number of voices as opposed to being a lone voice in that sea of people up on Capitol Hill. And I think again, so the previous slide where we're talking about sort of taking a hard look at universal service, universal connectivity needs, and seeing if there what is the role of that, and could there be changes made to that? So, for example, would tribal areas and tribal entities serving them be served by, say, a tribal broadband fund that maybe tries to specifically target funding to those areas that we know from the rollout of telephone and early numbers on broadband these are going to be areas that traditionally may not have been served on the front end of those technologies, right? And so is there a way to maybe recognize that history and still and bend it by, say, maybe doing like a broadband, a tribal broadband fund? And so those sorts of ideas that maybe people could get around as a group would be good to advance. And then, you know, the one-offs can be done in, as well.
Thanks, Craig. That's helpful. I guess my follow-up question to that, and really moving into you know, specific you know, action items and takeaway points for those attending today's webinar, is really kind of, you know, how should tribes engage and what are the opportunities? So is there an opportunity and a need at this point for them to be contacting their legislators? Should they be, you know, paying attention to and attending public hearings? And are there public hearings at this point on this? Should they simply be, you know, looking for opportunities to work then with the regional and national tribal organizations, or sort of an all-above approach? What would your recommendations be for, you know, those representing tribes on today's call in terms of, you know, what action items that they may be, they might start thinking about taking with regard to the Communications Act rewrite?
Sure. So, you know, right now the members of the House and Senate are back home working their districts in advance of the election. And so, you know, if there are opportunities while they're in the homes, you know, while they're home and before the election, to meet with them and tell them that, you know, you're interested and you're going to be engaging on this. That's obviously something that's helpful for them to know, you know. And then at this point, there are no public hearings right now, and you know, the committee still has issues like you know, TV, cable, and those sort of media issues that they could tee up in a white paper. They have you know, what to do about public safety still to tee up, possibly. But I do know that they're eager when the new Congress starts in January to get moving quickly. And in some ways, they're using this period of recess to sort of look at this record with you know, to figure out how they might structure the next steps, which will be a series of hearings. And so stay tuned. January of next year, expect, as usual, when there's a new Congress, people are going to be eager to start moving forward on things, and so probably a flurry of hearings fairly early on in the next Congress around this topic.
Okay,
yeah,
just thanks, Greg, and go ahead.
Yeah, one last thing, and so, you know, obviously there are opportunities through associations to remain aware of when these things are happening. You know, I know, Randy, you guys put together some information on this. There are other associations out there that kind of work to do this, and so, you know, getting engaged with those guys is also a good way to do it. Yeah, just keeping your eyes out.
Right. Okay, thanks. And just a reminder to everybody, if you have specific questions for Greg, type those into the questions box on the webinar toolbar, and we'll address those. Greg, my last question, and you've pretty much addressed this already, but my last follow-up question was really kind of when tribes should be engaging, you know, on this issue, and even more specifically, are there any immediate dates that you're aware of that folks should put on their calendar? So, I mean, you know, what I heard you saying, you know, a lot of this work will really start taking off in January once the new Congress is sworn in, and you're correct. We will be posting information as we receive it on the Tribal Telecom Conference.com website, and in fact, we're working on revamping our news and events page so that we can be broadcasting not just information about what's happening with Tribal Telecom with the webinars and the conference, but also other news and events in this arena of telecommunications and technology relating to American Indian Alaska Native communities. And so we'll continue to broadcast, those dates. But are there any immediate dates that you're aware of that folks should put on their calendar, either any hearings coming up or anything else that they should be aware of?
Not that I can think of. I mean, like I say, right now it's everybody is squarely focused on the election, and so there will be this period of quiet. There'll be a lame duck session. Not sure how long that will be, where members will be back and they might have an opportunity to do something. But usually lame ducks are pretty much, let's get what we need to get done and head back out. But if the Senate changes, it may be that there's more of an interest in the staff at the staff level engaging early, as opposed to waiting until January to get up and running. And so, that could be a triggering event, and maybe Randy, you and I can plan to chat a little bit post-election if that's the case, and I'll give you, we can update folks about what we're hearing.
That sounds great. So I don't show that we have any questions up. So I'm going to cover a few additional housekeeping items, and in the last few minutes here, if you do have a lingering question, you can type that in, and we'll go ahead and address that. And then you can always certainly follow up with Greg, and his contact information will be available at the end of this slide presentation. Let's see, switch over here. So I wanted to talk about a couple upcoming items. One is upcoming webinars. Our next scheduled webinar is actually next Tuesday, September 30th. We've got two fantastic presenters, Vanessa Gleach, who's with the American Indian Chamber Education Fund, PTAC, and then also Steve Caprence, who is a nationally recognized attorney who specializes in government contracting. They'll be talking about the advantages of the SBA 8A program, the Small Business Administration's program for small and disadvantaged businesses. In October, and we don't have these up on the slide or on the website, but they'll be posted on the website here in just the next couple days. We've got two programs in October. Steve Caprence is going to come back and do a more in-depth webinar focusing on opportunities for joint ventures and partnerships within the 8A, the Small Business Administration's 8A program. And then we also have another program scheduled in October that is called Winning Grant Funds for Tribal Telecom Projects. So you want to make sure and check the tribaltelecomconference.com website for information on those two programs. And then in November, we've got two programs that will be put on by the USDA Rural Utility Service that Greg was just talking about earlier in the presentation. On November 4th, we've got a program focused on the substantially underserved trust areas. And then on November 18th, we've got a program on broadband and telecom grant programs, and specifically the Community Connect and distant learning and telemedicine grant programs. So again, be sure to check the tribaltelecomconference.com website for information on those and to register for those webinars. And then also be sure and save the date and visit the website for information about next year's conference, May 4 through 7, 2015, which will be held in Albuquerque. Online registration is now open, and you can also find information about sponsoring and exhibiting during the conference next year. And then finally, please take a few minutes to complete our post-webinar survey and help us select future topics that will be beneficial to your community. And let me just check one last time, and I don't see that we've got any questions from the attendees. So Greg, thank you very much for today's program and presenting. And thank you, everybody, for attending today's webinar, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, Randy.